At a work party, I met a woman sharing her life story, and only then did I realize she was my wife's colleague. The office party was in full swing, but the room felt strangely surreal. The chatter of colleagues, the clinking of glasses, and the soft jazz playing in the background all blurred together into something more like a warm, ambient hum. Standing near the refreshment table, the male narrator, 25 years old, adjusted his blazer nervously, feeling slightly out of place. He wasn't the type to enjoy these gatherings, the forced mingling, the casual jokes about work performance. It was all a little too much. Yet here he was, compelled to attend, caught somewhere between obligation and curiosity. Across the room, she appeared, 40 years old, an American woman with striking black hair, elegance in every movement. Her confidence was effortless, her posture straight but relaxed, yet there was a softness in her gaze that drew attention without demanding it. She moved among the small clusters of people with ease, laughing lightly, her voice carrying just enough to be noticed without overpowering the room. The way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, or adjusted the cuff of her blouse added to her graceful presence, subtle movements that suggested both composure and a quiet vulnerability. Their eyes met briefly across the room, and something unspoken passed between them, an almost imperceptible spark of curiosity. He noticed the warmth in her eyes, the way they seemed to hold a story she hadn't yet told. Compelled, he moved toward her, feeling a mixture of apprehension and intrigue. "Hi, I don't think we've met," he said, his voice steady despite the slight flutter in his chest. She turned to face him fully, her black hair catching the soft glow of the overhead lights. "I don't think so," she replied, a polite smile touching her lips. "I'm glad we finally have a moment to talk." Her tone was conversational, but carried a depth, like someone who had seen much of life yet still found curiosity in others. As they spoke, he couldn't help but notice the subtleties, the way her hand lightly brushed a glass as she gestured, or the way her eyes lingered on him just a moment longer when he shared a small anecdote about work. The audience should feel the tension and warmth building. He is drawn to her energy, captivated by her presence, yet completely unaware of who she truly is in his personal life. There's a small, natural touch, a brief hand on his shoulder as she laughs at a joke, a leaning in to emphasize a point, but nothing overtly romantic yet. These gestures, simple yet intimate, hint at the chemistry simmering beneath the surface. The setting contributes as well, a brightly lit office party, warm ambient lighting reflecting off polished floors and glasses, and soft background chatter that frames their conversation in a world that seems to shrink to just the two of them. Internally, he feels the pull of intrigue and admiration. Every word she speaks reveals confidence and experience, a combination that is both attractive and humbling. The audience should sense his internal dialogue, curiosity, fascination, and a subtle awareness that this encounter feels different, charged with an unspoken energy. By the end of this part, the hook is set, a slow-burning intrigue, emotional tension, and sensory detail immerse viewers, while the audience is left waiting for the next moment when the connection deepens and the story begins to reveal the layers of personal history hidden beneath the casual conversation. The conversation deepened naturally, almost effortlessly, as if the room around them had blurred into background noise. The office party continued, laughter, music, the faint clinking of glasses, but for the 25-year-old man, none of it mattered. He found himself fully focused on her, the 40-year-old American woman with black hair, poised and self-assured, yet with an underlying softness that hinted at hidden layers of vulnerability. She leaned slightly forward, elbows resting lightly on the polished countertop, her fingers tracing the rim of her wine glass absent-mindedly as she spoke. She began sharing pieces of her life story, not the surface-level anecdotes everyone expected at a social event, but genuine insights into her experiences, challenges she had faced, small triumphs that had shaped her, and the quiet lessons learned over time. Her voice was calm, measured, and warm, carrying an effortless authority that drew his attention completely. He listened intently, leaning slightly closer as if drawn not just to her words, but to the cadence and subtle inflections of her voice. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, soft, floral, and comforting, grounding him in the moment. As she spoke about her journey in the workplace, she touched on moments of doubt, decisions she had wrestled with, and the small victories that gave her confidence. Her hands moved gracefully, emphasizing points, occasionally brushing a strand of black hair behind her ear. Each gesture, subtle but deliberate, revealed personality and emotional depth. The man found himself noticing not just what she said, but how she carried herself, the tilt of her head, the warmth in her eyes, and the brief, thoughtful pauses before she continued. He shared small responses here and there, nods, brief smiles, reflective comments, but mostly, he listened. The dialogue created a magnetic pull, a slow, simmering intimacy that was emotional rather than physical, yet profoundly connective. His internal reflections raced, admiration for her confidence, curiosity about the stories she chose to share, and a subtle sense of being unsettled by a feeling he couldn't quite place. Every movement, every glance, carried weight. When she laughed softly at a humorous memory, her hand brushed his momentarily against the counter, just light contact, but enough to make his chest tighten, sending an unexpected warmth through him. The background details enhanced the intimacy of the moment. Warm overhead lighting bathed the kitchen and surrounding space, highlighting the reflective surfaces of marble counters and polished wood. The hum of the party faded into a subtle blur, leaving the two of them in a bubble of quiet focus. He became acutely aware of her expressions, the softness of her smile, the fleeting flash of vulnerability in her eyes, the gentle arch of her brows when she spoke of regret or joy. These details made the conversation feel layered, alive, and rich with subtext. By the end of this part, the audience should feel the growing tension and intrigue, an emotional connection forming quietly, almost imperceptibly, rooted in attentive listening and subtle cues. The man is drawn in completely, captivated by her depth and warmth, yet unaware of the extraordinary twist awaiting him, a slow-burning tension that sets the stage for revelations, self-reflection, and the eventual shocking realization of who she truly is in his life. This keynote emphasizes emotional intimacy, sensory-rich detail, and slow romantic tension, keeping viewers immersed while building curiosity for what comes next. The conversation had taken on a rhythm of its own, a quiet cadence that felt private despite the party buzzing around them. The 25-year-old man, standing near the kitchen island, found himself leaning in slightly, not just physically, but emotionally. Every word she spoke, every pause she allowed, seemed to carry a subtle weight. The 40-year-old American woman with black hair, elegant, confident, and quietly alluring, continued to share stories from her life. Her voice was soft but compelling, and her gestures added layers of meaning. A delicate tilt of her head when recalling a memory, fingers lightly tapping the edge of her glass, a fleeting touch of her hand to her collarbone as she spoke of something particularly personal. He noticed these gestures, small but charged with authenticity, and felt an almost imperceptible tension that neither fully understood. When she laughed at a humorous memory, it was a soft, melodic sound, and her hand brushed his against the countertop, light, unassuming, yet enough to send a small, electric awareness through him. The warmth of the room seemed to envelope them, bright lights reflecting gently off polished surfaces and glassware, framing them, as if the rest of the party had dissolved into background noise. Her stories grew more personal, moments of struggle, choices she had made, the delicate balancing act of career and life. Each anecdote revealed a woman who was deeply self-aware and emotionally complex. She leaned in slightly when emphasizing her points, her eyes meeting his with a gaze that suggested understanding, curiosity, and an unspoken invitation to connect. He responded in kind, nodding, offering brief comments, his posture mirroring hers subtly, shoulders leaning forward, attention fixed on her every word. The audience should feel this growing intimacy, the silent language of shared space, the near-magnetic pull of attentive listening and empathy. Subtle clues began to emerge, details that resonated with him on an almost subconscious level. A way she described an event, a phrase that sounded familiar, the gentle way she touched her hair, or adjusted her sleeves, small indicators that something in her life intersected with his own. Yet he didn't consciously recognize the connection. Instead, it created a quiet sense of intrigue and emotional curiosity, the kind of tension that is felt in a slow-burn romance, anticipation without certainty, warmth without overt declaration. Physicality remained restrained yet meaningful. Hands resting briefly near each other, leaning slightly toward one another while speaking, a fleeting glance that lingers just long enough to register in the chest. The subtle choreography of proximity and gesture built emotional intimacy, allowing viewers to sense the chemistry without crossing into anything inappropriate. The lighting and environment amplified this intimacy. Bright, warm illumination highlighted faces, hair, and expressive hands. The reflective marble and polished wooden surfaces caught small glimmers of light, creating a cozy, inviting atmosphere. The background party sounds, chatter, music, laughter, remained faintly audible, contrasting the private bubble that seemed to exist around them. By the end of this keynote, the audience should feel the narrator's growing fascination and emotional engagement, the unspoken tension, and the subtle clues pointing toward a larger revelation. This is the moment where the bond deepens, where attention to nuance, body language, and small gestures allows the slow-burn romance to take root. It sets the stage for the next part, the moment when personal connections collide with reality, and the suspense begins to peak. This section emphasizes emotional attunement, sensory detail, and gradual tension, drawing the viewer into the nuanced dance of human connection before the dramatic revelation. The conversation had shifted from light anecdotes to something more layered, more personal. The 25-year-old man, standing with his hands loosely resting on the polished kitchen counter, felt a quiet intensity settle over the space between them. The 40-year-old American woman with black hair, elegant and poised, had moved closer, her posture relaxed but her expression deeply thoughtful. She spoke in a calm, deliberate tone, sharing a story about her family, her marriage, and the subtle struggles that had shaped her life. Her eyes softened with each memory, glimmering with a mixture of pride, vulnerability, and a hint of nostalgia. Her gestures were precise and telling, one hand lightly brushing her hair from her face, the other tracing invisible patterns on the countertop, her fingers brushing against the cool marble. The man noticed the small nuances, the slight quiver in her lips when she described a painful decision, the faint tightening of her jaw when recalling a difficult moment. Each detail made the story feel real, tangible, and emotionally resonant. The audience should feel the tension as he begins to sense familiarity in her words, though the realization hasn't fully struck yet. As she described moments with her husband, small acts of love, shared routines, and unspoken understanding, the man felt a strange pull, a sense of déjà vu that unsettled him. The subtleties in her story, the phrases she used, the way she described intimacy without explicitly naming names, it all stirred a quiet recognition he couldn't quite place. The narrative is steeped in nuance, the audience can sense that the revelation is looming, creating suspense, but the characters are still dancing around it, caught in layers of human complexity. The physicality between them remained understated but intimate. When she leaned forward to emphasize a point, their shoulders brushed lightly. When she laughed softly, her hand briefly rested near his on the counter. These gestures conveyed warmth, emotional resonance, and subtle connection, without crossing boundaries. Her expressions fluctuated between confidence and vulnerability, creating a push-pull dynamic that drew him in emotionally. The environment amplified the intimacy of the moment. Bright overhead lights illuminated their faces and the reflective surfaces of the kitchen, capturing every subtle glance, every small movement of her hands. The background hum of the party, murmured conversations, distant laughter, soft music, faded into a blur, framing them as if they were in a bubble of their own. This lighting and setting emphasize clarity, emotional warmth, and focus on the characters' subtle interplay, drawing viewers into the scene. Internally, the man wrestled with a growing awareness that something about this woman felt profoundly familiar. He studied the cadence of her voice, the rhythm of her storytelling, and the way she expressed emotion. Each detail heightened the tension, admiration for her depth, curiosity about her life, and a creeping suspicion that there was more to her than met the eye. By the end of this keynote, the audience should feel suspense rising, emotional connection deepening, and anticipation building. This is the point where the slow burn tension reaches a peak in terms of emotional intimacy, the moment where familiarity and personal resonance hint at a revelation that is both shocking and inevitable. The narrative is now primed for the turning point, where realization and inner conflict collide. The kitchen seemed to shrink around them, the bustling office party fading into the background until it was nothing more than a soft blur of light and sound. The 25-year-old man leaned against the marble counter, listening to her laugh and speak with warmth and sincerity. The 40-year-old American woman with black hair, poised and graceful, gestured animatedly as she shared a memory about her husband, how he surprised her with a small gesture of care, how he had supported her through a difficult decision, how the unspoken understanding between them shaped their everyday lives. Each sentence was delivered with quiet authority, and yet, each carried a vulnerability that made her feel alive and real. As he listened, a chill ran down his spine. The cadence of her words, the details of her anecdotes, the particular way she described her life, all of it felt oddly familiar. His mind raced, piecing together the subtle hints he had subconsciously noticed in the past conversations. A specific phrase she used, the way her fingers moved when she emphasized a point, the gentle tilt of her head, it all started to click. His chest tightened, and a subtle awareness bloomed. This was not just a colleague. This was someone intimately connected to the life he knew so well. The realization hit him like a physical weight. He inhaled sharply, his hands gripping the cool marble countertop, as if it could anchor him to reality. His heart pounded in his chest, and yet, outwardly, he remained calm, his expression neutral, eyes fixed on her face. She continued, unaware of the storm quietly brewing in him. The audience should feel the tension of this moment, the dramatic irony of her oblivion contrasted with his internal shock. Every subtle gesture, every glance, every laugh became magnified under the lens of his realization. She smiled softly at a memory, brushing a strand of black hair behind her ear. The motion, so familiar yet unnoticed before, now triggered a cascade of recognition. He felt a strange mixture of admiration, disbelief, and emotional vulnerability. The warmth of the room, the golden glow of the kitchen lights reflecting off polished surfaces, suddenly seemed to heighten every detail, her expressive eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, the graceful movements of her hands. Each small action struck him with new meaning. Despite the intensity of his internal revelation, he chose restraint. He didn't interrupt, didn't reveal his knowledge, didn't let his surprise slip into his voice or posture. Instead, he focused on listening, letting the subtle warmth of her presence wash over him, acknowledging her story and her vulnerability silently. The tension became almost unbearable, as the audience is invited to share in the narrator's conflicted emotions, awe, connection, guilt, and wonder, all interwoven into a single, heightened emotional moment. The physical space mirrored the emotional landscape. Her hand rested lightly on the counter, fingers occasionally brushing his as she reached for a glass, unaware of the recognition his mind had made. The soft clink of her gestures, the shimmer of light on the marble, the warm reflection from the overhead lamps, it all became a cinematic tableau, charged with silent revelation. By the end of this keynote, the audience should feel the apex of emotional tension. The slow burn narrative has reached its turning point, the man has realized the truth, the connection between them is clear, and yet nothing has been said aloud. The next step, the navigation of this revelation, will define the emotional trajectory moving forward. The realization hung in the air like a delicate, invisible thread, pulling at every corner of his mind. The 25-year-old man stood almost frozen, his hands lightly resting on the smooth marble countertop, feeling its cool surface anchor him even as his chest raced. Across from him, the 40-year-old American woman with black hair, poised, graceful, and subtly vulnerable, continued speaking, unaware of the storm that had just landed in his thoughts. She gestured gently, her fingers occasionally brushing the counter, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm and sincerity. Her laughter was soft, melodic, a sound that now carried a weight of irony and poignancy for him, considering what he had just realized. He forced himself to remain outwardly calm, letting the warm, bright kitchen lighting illuminate their shared space without betraying the sudden intensity of his emotions. Internally, his thoughts spiraled. Each story she told, every reference to her husband or family, made his pulse quicken, his mind piecing together details he had previously ignored or forgotten. The realization that she was intimately connected to someone so close to him, and yet oblivious of his identity, created a complex cocktail of fascination, surprise, and guilt. Despite the inner chaos, he chose restraint. He couldn't speak yet. Any words could shatter the delicate flow of her trust and the ease of the conversation. So instead, he focused on the sensory details, the warmth of the kitchen lights reflecting off her expressive eyes, the subtle scent of her perfume, a faint floral hint that had always seemed comforting, and the gentle rhythm of her gestures. She leaned forward slightly as she made a point, and his eyes caught the brief brush of her hand against the countertop, near his own. The contact was fleeting, innocent, but charged with a kind of intimacy that the audience could feel. Her expressions told stories of their own, the small flicker of vulnerability in her eyes when she described a difficult decision, the quiet strength in her posture as she recounted personal challenges, and the faint, reflective smile she offered when speaking of happier moments. Each of these details layered the tension, deepening his emotional response. The bright, warm lighting highlighted every nuance, her hands moving gracefully, her hair glinting as it caught the light, the subtle warmth of her smile, and magnified the complexity of his emotions. The man's mind wrestled with conflicting impulses. Curiosity pushed him to learn more, to listen closer, to savor the unexpected intimacy. Responsibility urged caution, reminding him that revelation could be disruptive or even painful. Affection and admiration mingled with guilt and hesitation, creating a tension that was palpable yet unspoken. The slow burn of unacknowledged attraction and emotional resonance filled the room with a quiet intensity, the kind that is felt in small glances, shared silence, and subtle gestures rather than loud declarations. He leaned just slightly toward her, careful not to make the gesture noticeable, his eyes tracking her expressions, as if memorizing the contours of her mood and personality. The kitchen became a private world, a bubble separated from the party outside, emphasizing the intimacy and quiet gravity of the moment. Every detail, from the reflective surfaces to the warm illumination to the soft hum of background conversation, underscored the slow, steady tension between unspoken knowledge and emotional restraint. By the end of this keynote, the audience should feel the delicate balance of intrigue, restraint, and emotional closeness. He has realized her identity, yet chooses silence, creating suspense and depth while highlighting the subtle, non-verbal intimacy between them. The narrative is poised for the final act, where emotional reflection and connection will bring closure, growth, and quiet resolution. This section emphasizes emotional restraint, tension, and sensory richness, showing how one internal revelation can shift perspective while deepening the unspoken bond. The party had started to wind down, the ambient chatter softening, the clinking of glasses fading into background murmur. The 25-year-old man remained in the kitchen, leaning lightly against the countertop, his thoughts a tangle of reflection and quiet awe. The 40-year-old American woman with black hair, poised and graceful, had moved a few steps away, her attention momentarily drawn to other guests. She carried herself with effortless confidence, yet in her laughter and the small gestures she made, the soft tuck of a stray hair behind her ear, the gentle tilt of her head, there was still a flicker of warmth and vulnerability that had anchored his focus all evening. The realization from earlier still hummed beneath the surface of his mind. He had recognized her as his wife's colleague, and that knowledge created a complex tension between admiration, respect, and the subtle thrill of connection. But now, as the room quieted, he allowed himself to breathe, to process the cascade of emotions the evening had stirred. There was a soft ache in his chest, A quiet gratitude for having shared in this unexpected intimacy without overstepping boundaries. He felt an emotional closeness that didn't require words, an understanding that grew in silence, in observation, in the unspoken acknowledgement of each other's humanity. She turned briefly, catching his eye. Her smile was subtle, reflective, almost knowing, though not aware of the storm she had stirred in him. Her posture remained elegant, but there was a softness to her gaze, an openness that invited quiet reflection. He met her glance, letting it linger just long enough to convey appreciation and attention, a silent conversation passing between them without a single word. Her presence was warm and grounding, and in that moment, the kitchen, the bright, warmly lit space with its reflective marble counters and polished surfaces, felt like a sanctuary, separate from the world outside, a space for private reflection within the public sphere of the party. The man's hands rested lightly on the countertop, fingers tracing invisible patterns, as he replayed her stories in his mind. He thought of her laughter, the cadence of her speech, the small, natural gestures that had made the evening feel intimate and alive. Every detail, the tilt of her chin, the glint of light on her hair, the way her hands moved as she spoke, had left an imprint, building an emotional resonance that was both subtle and profound. He realized that the connection he felt was not just about recognition or intrigue, it was about witnessing her life, her experiences, and the quiet strength she carried, and feeling drawn to the humanity and vulnerability she revealed. As she stepped away to mingle with others, he allowed himself a small, reflective smile, a gesture of closure and respect. The tension that had lingered earlier, the uncertainty, the thrill, the emotional pull, softened into a sense of calm understanding. The audience should feel the bittersweet warmth of the moment, a connection acknowledged, a story shared, a silent bond formed without the need for overt romance. There was no rush, no dramatic declaration, just the quiet, lingering effect of emotional intimacy, subtle affection, and mutual respect. By the end of this part, the story reaches emotional closure. The man has processed the revelation, acknowledged the bond, and allowed the moment to exist in quiet beauty. The kitchen remains brightly lit, warm and welcoming, reflecting the clarity and emotional resolution of the scene. The audience is left with a sense of completion, an ending that is reflective, tender, and emotionally satisfying, honoring the slow-burn nature of the story while emphasizing connection, understanding, and the subtle power of shared humanity. This section highlights emotional closure, reflective intimacy, and sensory richness, providing a gentle, resonant resolution to the narrative while leaving a lasting impression of subtle connection and personal growth.